Welcome to Headliners Forum. We're here to bring you the best in Texas journalism, the stories behind the great stories. I'm Mark Morrison. Our special guests are Lauren McGaughy and Dave Boucher of the Dallas Morning News. Their series called The Memory Room revealed how Texas police and prosecutors were using hypnosis to help send dozens of people to prison. The practice involves some risk and actually has been banned in at least 21 states. But in 2020, Texas still allowed it. This project won the Headliners Foundation Silver Award, competing against top news organizations across the state. Dave and Lauren, congratulations on your great journalism, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Lauren, could you start by sharing a little history of how you and your colleagues got interested in this subject and decided to launch a major investigative effort?
Sure. Well, back in the summer of 2018, I was actually talking with a source of mine who offhand mentioned that police in Texas were still using hypnosis to investigate crimes. And I thought that that was a little wacky. So I got some figures and stats from the state, looked into it a little bit more, and I wrote a short piece on it in May 2018. And at the time, I was on the politics team and Dave was on the investigative team. He read the story and reached out and said, "Hey, this seems really interesting. It seems like there's a lot more here. Would you want to dig a little deeper?" And I said, that sounded great. And we had actually just heard from a reader who read my earlier story about just hypnosis and police work in general. And he had reached out because he was involved in a case in the late 80s where he was on a jury that had convicted someone. And so everything kind of started coming together from there.
Right. Dave, this practice has a history in Texas. How long had it been going on, and how had it become incorporated into law enforcement and databases?
You're right. So we know that Texas Rangers had been using hypnosis since at least 1980. We have records dating back to then of different sort of sessions that these law enforcement officers were conducting. And to be clear, these sessions were done by law enforcement, not by a trained therapist or doctor or anyone like that. These were actual Texas Rangers conducting these sessions. And they use these sessions on any number of criminal investigations. So we found, lots of murder investigations or other serious felony investigations, but we also found any sort of other, what you might consider poultry investigation. Someone used hypnosis in an investigation of a missing $1 million ring. Someone used hypnosis in an investigation of how a boy might have been scratched. They think, I believe the records indicated that they thought it was a cat that scratched him. So the Rangers weren't just using this on cold cases or to try and get to a lead on a long sought after murder case. Especially in the 1980s, this was used on any number of investigations.
And how did it was typically used? I read about some cases where a witness maybe forgot what the suspect looked like in a particular crime, and they would use hypnosis to try to bring the memory back. And I guess that's one example. What are some of the things they try to figure out by use of hypnosis?
So generally, and Lauren can speak to this as well, hypnosis was used as something many times as a last resort. So if there was an investigation where investigators thought that the trails went cold, they would talk to a witness just in general to try and bring out additional information. And that could be due to, either time elapsing or a potentially traumatic event or some other factor that they decided necessitated the need for hypnosis.
And Lauren, your team identified a number of risks that are involved when you use hypnosis as an investigative tool. What are some of those risks that have caused many states to ban the practice?
Sure. There's four key risks that are commonly accepted with hypnosis. And this is when you're using hypnosis really for any purpose, but it applies most importantly to this very dubious practice of trying to revive, refresh, or refine memory through hypnosis. So these four pitfalls are suggestion, which is people under hypnosis tend to be more suggestible. So if the hypnotist provides a detail that wasn't actually in the original memory, the hypnotized person might incorporate that detail into their memory. A second pitfall is the loss of critical thinking skills. Generally, especially as Americans, because of our understanding based on popular culture of how hypnosis is quote unquote supposed to work, we think about it as a truth serum when it truly is not. And so sometimes people who believe that they're hypnotized will lose those valuable critical thinking skills. One of the most dangerous risks of hypnosis when you're talking about memory is something called confabulation, which is creation of false memories. So what I said before about maybe as an act of suggestion, the hypnotist accidentally offers up a detail that was not actually in the original memory. That memory can then be incorporated or confabulated into the memory and become, according to the person under hypnosis, part of the memory, even though it didn't originally exist. And then finally, after the hypnosis session is over, people that believe they were hypnotized have a tendency to believe even more strongly in the version of events that they told under hypnosis, even if that version of events isn't true. And that's called memory cementation.
Yeah. And Lauren, you found that the combination of some of those risks actually led to some false or wrongful convictions and people getting to prison who became a victim of this process and its imperfections.
That's true. In almost every other state that has banned this practice or seriously cracked down on it, it was due to a case where other evidence came up that exonerated exonerated the individual or questioned the original findings from the hypnosis session. And so, this is something that in other states has come under serious question due to these pitfalls. And Texas just had dealt with cases that dealt with hypnosis, but instead of banning the practice, they instead chose to put into place a number of what they believed were best practices for law enforcement use of hypnosis. But the best practices at best were guidelines. They were not boxes that you had to check off or you couldn't use hypnosis. And there was really no one checking to see if law enforcement were even abiding by these best practices that the court set out.
Right. Dave, it seems like the Dallas Police, Texas Rangers, and other law enforcement you contacted were not too eager to respond to your questions about this subject. And you guys had a lot of challenges doing the reporting. Can you tell us about some of those and how you overcame them?
Sure. So you're right. When law enforcement agencies found out that we were, I guess, taking a critical eye on the practice, they were less forthcoming to talk about it. Agencies have historically talked about it, broadly speaking, especially in terms of like when they thought it was essentially going to be portrayed as like something nice or like an innovative tool. They were not forthcoming when we asked some of these questions that Lauren mentioned about memory cementation or making things up during hypnosis. So we relied a lot on records for this case, for this story. We were able to go back and find court transcripts from a case that became kind of the central narrative arc of our story. That was a Dallas case. And so those court records really helped us kind of go through some of the arguments that are involved with why it's dangerous for law enforcement to use hypnosis. And then we put in a slew of public records requests all over the state. So with agencies who had licensed hypnotists and with Texas Rangers. the Texas Rangers records ended up being really critical for us. They had never released this information before. And these were records of, the results of hypnosis sessions, how often they did it, who was involved, the case that it was involved with, and other key details. They fought us at every step of the way. We eventually appealed their decision to not release both records and video of these to the Texas Attorney General, and the Attorney General's office agreed with us that those records should be public. And again, ultimately, it resulted in releasing hundreds of records from these sessions that had never been published before.
Right.
And some of these records, Mark, sorry to jump in, were audio and video. And that for us was so key because it allowed us to determine how long the sessions were, what exact words were used, because they didn't keep notes, there were no transcripts. And it really key finding of those sessions, some of which were very recent, was that they were using hypnosis techniques that were put down on paper 40 years ago. These were not new, they were not updated, they were not based in modern science. They were very antiquated, oftentimes debunked methods for using the practice, which was really concerning. And we would have never known that without the records.
Right. Lauren, one of the things that made your stories so compelling were some of the examples that you uncovered. And one of them that struck me as very powerful was the one about the SMU student who was attacked in her apartment, but they had trouble identifying suspects and her memory was blurred. Tell us how that one unfolded.
Sure. So this was the main narrative for our entire investigation. It really anchored the project. And this was the case that the reader, who was the juror that reached out to me just before Dave suggested we do a project, this was the case that he actually was a juror on. So it was really fascinating to look into it. And it dated to the late 80s, 1988. A young white SMU student was attacked in her bed in the night by someone wielding a blunt object, and she was bludgeoned several times. She recovered from her injuries, but was unable to identify a suspect. Initially, she said that he was built like a Black security guard at the complex where she lived. But even weeks later, she told law enforcement that she was unable to identify the subject. So there were some very serious police missteps in the investigation. And eventually, after it had stalled, they turned to hypnosis, as Dave said, a last-ditch means to try to recover some sort of potential success in the case. And after they did this hypnosis session with the victim, she named the security guard as her attacker and picked him out of a lineup. This was key because only after the hypnosis session was that strong identification made. And then when we got to trial, it was truly her word against his. She spoke very passionately at trial about her attack. She said that she always knew it was him from the beginning, which is contrary to what she told law enforcement. And he did not testify on his behalf because his lawyers told him not to. So race and sex kind of underscored the entire case. There were lots of references to him being sexually attracted to her, to him being sexually attracted to white women, and that being a factor in potentially the attack. And eventually he was convicted. There was no physical evidence. There were no witnesses other than her word post hypnosis. And he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. He had no criminal record. And in fact, he was training at the time to become a police officer himself. So it was a very fascinating case to look into.
Right. These stories had tremendous impact, which is one of the criteria that we use for judging Showcase. And Dave, talk about some of the changes that occurred in some of the law enforcement agencies and otherwise with the points that your stories made so poignantly.
Sure. So almost immediately after our story, state lawmakers came out with bills that would essentially ban the use of investigative or forensic hypnosis to aid with criminal investigations. There had been similar efforts in the past, the Texas legislature that hadn't really gone anywhere, but those efforts were renewed. It led to lots of fun legislative wrangling and back and forth and debates about whether or not somebody could be hypnotized but then not testify, or whether you could use that information to glean other information. Eventually, a bill made it out of the legislature with wide bipartisan support, and it was vetoed by the governor. So there was obviously, again, legislative support for this change. There was some back and forth and some pushback, but eventually a bill did make it to the governor that was vetoed. At the same time, months after the story, we learned that the Texas Rangers had just stopped using hypnosis. Hypnosis is not necessarily a common police tactic today, or at least not nearly as common as it was before, but the Rangers were still using this. We found records to indicate that they were using it on murder investigations at the time that we were doing this investigation. But the Rangers did confirm that they were no longer using hypnosis. And so, as Lauren mentioned, this brought just additional scrutiny to this practice that is still allowed in Texas and could be going on at police departments all over the state, because there's just very little oversight of this entire practice as well.
Yeah, it seems like at the very least there should be some regulation, not just guidelines that might be followed or not followed, but some pretty tight rules if this is going to be allowed in some cases. And of course, there's a strong argument, as you said, for not allowing it as well.
I would just say, Mark, that even if you were to look at all of the rules that proponents of this say are in place, and you accept that all of those rules are followed, the basic tenets of hypnosis are what truly make this a dangerous practice for police. As Lauren mentioned, hypnotists are suggesting ideas to witnesses. Now, they would potentially argue that they're not, but in order to get someone into a hypnotic state, it requires suggestion. That is part of the entire process. That's why hypnosis, in theory, can be a useful way to quit smoking or lose weight. Hypnotists are telling you that you want to lose weight or that you don't want to smoke. But if you are a hypnotist and you have a witness under hypnosis and you suggest anything, that's a leading question or a leading suggestion that can have huge ramifications on a criminal investigation.
Yeah. And Lauren, you're in the Austin Bureau of the News now. Do you see a path forward for something beyond guidelines for this that would either strictly control it or make it unlawful altogether?
Well, I won't pretend to know what is in Governor Abbott's head, but he can always add it to one of the calls of a special session if he wants to revive it. He, in his veto message, he indicated that he does think that hypnosis has some problems. He didn't veto the bill because he's pro law enforcement hypnosis. He vetoed it because of an issue with how the bill was written in his view. And so, maybe if this bill came to his desk again, he would sign it if it was in a form that he liked. So that's a possibility. In terms of the only other way to really see any change in this practice is either law enforcement agencies choose to stop using it, which is difficult to know since we reached out to hundreds of them and many of them just didn't even respond to us. And the only other method is through the courts. There has been a death row case that has been winding its way through the long lawsuit process for years. It's a Dallas death row case, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court and the Supreme of the United States, and they decided not to take it up. So it's back at the Texas state court level, and that individual still has the opportunity to argue that the use of hypnosis in his case, if hypnosis wasn't used, then he would have never been convicted, which is his argument. And if that happens, then, you know, it might set some new precedent depending on how the judge rules. But, you know, that's a bit of a long shot now, given that he has lost his case at every step of the process up until this point.
Right.
So, you know, there's many mechanisms for there to be change on this issue, and there has been some positive movement, but we just haven't seen the axe come down on any of those yet.
And I know that you'll be following those developments for the news. Our showcase judges agreed with the Dallas News editors who said the memory room combined compelling storytelling with shoe leather reporting, records requests, data analysis, and legal research to shed light on a dangerous police practice that had remained in the shadows for decades. Lauren and Dave, thanks for helping us understand how you produce this outstanding work. You can link to the entire Dallas News series and to interviews with other award-winning Texas journalists on our site, headlinersfoundation.org. For Gary Pickle, producer of Headliners Forum, I'm Mark Morrison.
Okay, gang. I think that's fine. I'll look at the recording and we'll let you know if there's any problems with it, but I think everything's fine.
Yeah, it actually comes on and tells us that the recording has started now, which is this stuff keeps improving, doesn't it? We used to have to wait until the end. There'd be a long pause and Gary would